Trump. And this would be the second time we have done this. The first was the arraignment in New York on charges from Alvin Bragg, this being the federal charges in Florida over the handling of classified documents. Live pictures outside of the federal courthouse in Miami, where things are oddly calm. As we can best tell from the pictures, it is police who outnumber reporters, who then in turn outnumber the protesters that are there on the street. We understand that there are some pro-Trump supporters who you're looking at right now, and then some folks who don't much like the former president, would like him to stay in the federal courthouse and perhaps be in jail. We are an awfully long way from that. State of play right now, 2 o'clock Eastern. President Trump has made his way from the Doral, which is a resort near the airport that he owns, down to the federal courthouse in Miami ahead of a 3 o'clock Eastern arraignment on an indictment of 37 counts that deal with the handling, the retention of, and then the trying to keep in his possession about 100 classified documents from his time as president. We don't have any pictures of what's going on inside the courthouse. Federal courthouses are typically black boxes, if you will, for cameras, for pictures. We understand reporters who've gone in who have to turn over their phones and their other electronic devices. So this is going to be a little bit of a black box for the next 2 hours in terms of what's going on inside the courthouse. We understand that President Trump will be fingerprinted. He will be arraigned. He will not be put in handcuffs, and there will not be a mugshot, which is pretty typical for federal arraignments when a federal defendant who's not charged with a violent crime turns themselves in. Trump to surrender and face federal charges is what it says right now. Whether or not he has actually presented himself to authorities or not inside the courthouse, we don't know. We have, at least for a moment, we will get some pool feeds of information, not any kind of pictures, from inside the courthouse to tell us what's going on starting at 3 o'clock Eastern when this hearing is scheduled to get underway. A lot of folks joining us throughout the next couple of hours, not only to look at the legal side of this, but the political side as well, both from the Republican side and the Democratic side. Johanna Maska, formerly of the Obama administration, is with us now here in studio. Niall Stanage, White House columnist for The Hill, with us in terms of what the White House is saying, which is not a heck of a lot. They are enjoying being quiet today. In fact, they did their briefing a little bit earlier than normal today at the White House to try and just allow all of us to take in the activities in Florida. And former federal prosecutor now running for attorney general in the state of Missouri, Will Scharf. Will, just start with you from the very basic things of we've got a federal courthouse, which most of us never seen the inside of, and certainly never seen the inner workings of the inside of. An hour before this arraignment, just take us what's happening.
Sure. So President Trump will arrive at the courthouse. As you said, he'll likely be fingerprinted and fill out any amount of paperwork relating to the charges. An initial appearance in an arraignment, though, it's typically not a substantive hearing. The charges will be presented to the president. Either they'll be read from the indictment or President Trump will likely waive reading of the indictment. But an arraignment is really just an opportunity for the court to inform a defendant of the charges that he's facing, to ensure that he's represented by counsel, and really just to kick things off. In this case, it's going to be a long, windy legal process, and this is really just the first step.
How much, if any, insight do we get either into the prosecutor's case and their strategy, which I guess Jack Smith sort of laid out when he said we're ready for a speedy trial, and then do we get any insight into the defense strategy? Do we get any insight into what, if any, of the evidence they're going to try to quash, what witnesses they may try to disqualify, what motions may be filed, and how they plan to fight this?
All of what you're describing is what we refer to as pretrial motions. In this case, as you said, I expect that President Trump's legal team will seek to exclude at least some of the evidence that's been presented. They may seek to quash the results of the search warrant that was previously executed on Mar-a-Lago. I think more importantly, they're likely to move to dismiss some or all of these charges based on what they will claim are serious legal infirmities in the theory of the case that's been brought against the president. And that's what we call a dispositive motion. It's a motion that could potentially dispose of some or all of the charges at issue here. I think that's likely to be the next big step in this case, is an attempt by President Trump's legal team to get most or all of this case just thrown out altogether.
Representing him today in court, Chris Keiss, Todd Blanche. Blanche was with him at his last arraignment in New York. What do you make of this last-minute change in Trump's legal team?
Look, I think both of the lawyers he has representing him are outstanding. Obviously, Todd Blanche, long distinguished career. I believe he was most recently at Cadwalader, prominent white shoe law firm. Keiss is an eminent member of the Florida bar, a highly experienced attorney. I think President Trump really has an A-team representing him here, and I expect them to contest these charges vigorously.
What do you make as we watch this? What are we to make of the last-minute change in the president's legal representation from Jim Trusty and others now to this team?
Well, Todd Blanche has been representing the president on this case for, I believe, quite a while now. And Keiss has represented the president before. So I think a strategic decision was made that these were the right people to go with. They had the right, both courtroom and legal experience to provide the president with the most vigorous possible defense. And I think that's what we're going to see in the coming days. But the idea that President Trump isn't going to be effectively represented or anything like that, I think that's just garbage. Based on the folks who are going to be at counsel's table with him today inside that federal courthouse.
All right. And as we understand it, it's going to be a federal magistrate who's there who will run the proceedings for this, rather than the judge assigned to the case, Judge Eileen Cannon. Do we make anything of it? It seems as though that's pretty normal.
That's pretty typical, Leland. At the early stages of a criminal case like this, certainly for initial appearance and arraignment, it would be highly irregular for a magistrate judge not to be there. And I would guess that whichever magistrate is assigned will play a continuing role, at least with respect to pretrial motions. But this case will end up in front of Eileen Cannon one way or the other. That's true of any trial that might occur here. It's also true in terms of her being the ultimate decision maker on pretrial motions that are filed. So I
Robert
think
Robert Sherman just reported that Jack Smith flew down last night and is going to be in court. That I feel as though that is not all that out of the ordinary for a major hearing in this way, or is that unusual?
I'd be surprised if he weren't there. He's taken a very public role, as you noted, in outlining the charges and outlining his theory of the case. So there's nothing to me surprising about that, even though I believe his family lives abroad in the Netherlands. I expect that we'll be seeing a lot of him in court in Florida.
All right. Will, stand by for us. You and I sort of joked around at the beginning, Niall, that the one group of people we are not hearing from at all is the White House, and even really from Democratic circuits. Everybody's gone dark. What? Well, what's the play here?
The play is to avoid fueling the narrative that this is politically oriented. We know that's a narrative that the president's allies are leaning on pretty heavily. We know it is a narrative that is believed by Republican voters in particular. So for Democrats and for the White House, they don't want to add to this. They want to foster the impression that this is really about the administration of justice, about the idea that anyone, even a former president, is subject to the law, and that process should be let play out with the minimum of political interference.
It's interesting, though, in terms of the strategy, because in absence of any chiming in, we're not hearing very important things about law and order right now, which is actually President Biden is also being investigated by a special counsel, Robert Hur, in these kinds of document charges. And you're seeing kind of the right-wing conspiracy theory, run amok with Truth Social. Trump is posting about President Biden hasn't been charged, all of these things. It's unfair. And somebody does need to remind Americans that actually there are other investigations underway. This is a fair investigation. There has been no interference, and the Democrats staying quiet.
That we know of. And look, everyone is entitled to a defense. There's going to be the political defense, right, which is largely what we've heard from President Trump, and then there's going to be the legal defense, which is whatever we hear in court. Probably not today. May Malman, formerly of the White House counsel's office under President Trump, with us as well. May, what I think is interesting is sort of the arc of the defense by President Trump and his supporters, right? At first it was, we now understand, I don't have any classified documents. Then it was, oh, I have them, but I declassified them. That was my right. Now it is essentially, what about Hillary Clinton? And what I'm thinking about when we look at the indictment, just the four corners of it and the facts that have been laid out, the one thing you don't really hear from either Trump's team or from Trump's supporters is a denial of any of the facts in the indictment. What do you make of that?
Well, I think it's early to have a full-fledged denial for exactly the reason that you laid out. Sometimes as the lawyer, you only know what you know, and your client hasn't given you full information, so you don't want to look stupid. So, right now we're hearing the political defense. This is a politicized judicial branch. Everybody's out to get Trump. I think the Alvin Bragg case is very helpful to that political defense because that case was such a joke. So this is just, another version of that. I think that argument is one that is evergreen. You're going to be able to make that throughout the case. But this is specifically what happened. Here is the evidence that he declassified the documents. Here are the documents declassified. Here's when he did it. You're not going to be able to make that case because sometimes you don't know what you don't know. I mean, none of these lawyers were in the White House with him. And so they completely rely on their client, and their client Trump is infamous for making up things, spinning things however he feels like. And nobody who's even his supporter is going to deny that. So the lawyers, I think, have to be a little bit cautious because they owe a duty of candor to the court.
Right, and we know that one of his lawyers is quoted in the indictment. And Will, I think that's one of the more interesting parts of this, and something that the general public very rarely hears about, is the breaking of attorney-client privilege by the government to get effectively a lawyer to testify against his own client or provide evidence against his own client. We've seen that in the indictment. Does that necessarily mean, since that ruling is made, that it ends up before a jury when there is one?
Frankly, it's one of a number of irregularities or irregular features of this case. The short answer is we don't know. We don't know if the information President of the United States, and I should add a current candidate for the presidency. It's also due to the fact that this is the first time the Espionage Act, I believe, has been used to prosecute, violations of the Presidential Records Act. So there are just a lot of aspects of this case that are irregular, that are novel, and that's, as a legal commentator, as a lawyer, that's what I find most interesting about it.
All right. Christy Greenberg with us as well, Doug Burns. Christy, just in terms of what happens as we're sort of watching this, and I made the comment earlier that this is a little bit like watching the second moon landing. We kind of know how this is going to go, except we get even fewer pictures this time because we don't have that camera inside the courtroom, and we're not going to get any pictures of the president walking in or out of the courtroom. How long does something like this take? Those are pictures right now. It looks like some of President Trump's legal team that we think are going to talk after the hearing. How long is this going to take?
So an arraignment before a magistrate judge really does not take very long. You would expect the first thing to happen would be to have the magistrate judge offer to recite the charges so that the defendant knows what they are charged with. That can mean a reading of the indictment, or most likely his lawyers will waive the reading of the indictment. He will state affirmatively that he understands.
Christy, I'm going to interrupt you real quick. One of President Trump's attorneys now, we understand, is talking before the hearing. Let's listen in quick.
In Georgia and New York, and now this. The people in charge of this country do not love America. They hate Donald Trump. What we are witnessing today is the blatant and unapologetic weaponization of the criminal justice system. The Biden appointed special counsel has sought fit to bring 37 federal charges against President Trump, the leading frontrunner, less than a year and a half before an election. Countless other individuals, Hillary Clinton, Joe Biden himself, retained possession of classified documents yet have not been prosecuted. And none of them came into possession of those documents while they were president. None of them were president who, as the head and sole member of the executive branch, has the power to summarily declassify documents. The decision to pursue charges against President Trump while turning a blind eye to others is emblematic of the corruption that we have here. We are at a turning point in our nation's history. The targeting, prosecution of a leading political opponent is the type of thing you see in dictatorships like Cuba and Venezuela. It is commonplace there for rival candidates to be prosecuted, persecuted, and put into jail. What is being done to the President Trump should terrify all citizens of this country. These are not the ideals that our democracy is founded upon. This is not our America. Thank you.
So what's happening right now inside the courthouse? Has he been arrested? Has he been fingerprinted? Has a mugshot been taken? Walk us through what's happening here now.
President Trump is in a very unique position where he doesn't need to be given a mugshot, obviously. He is not a flight risk. He is the leading candidate of the GOP at the moment. He is going through a process that has been coordinated with Secret Service, and it will all be handled seamlessly.
Thank you, guys. The attorneys, what is his state of mind? Just real quick, how is he feeling?
He's defiant.
He's defiant.
Thank you.
All right, so that is Elena Haba, who's one of the president's lawyers, although not one who is going to represent him in court today. There's a picture of President Trump on his way to the courthouse. As you heard her, she said that he is going through a process that has been outlined with the Secret Service. No mugshot. There will be fingerprints, we understand, and he will not be placed in handcuffs, which is pretty similar to what happened in the New York case. Back now, real quick, to Christy Greenberg, who's been with us, former federal prosecutor. In everything that she just said, I did not hear a single legal argument for innocence.
You did not. And what is so interesting is that she argued about the weaponization of the Department of Justice. But what she doesn't point out is this indictment was brought by the people of the Southern District of Florida, a grand jury of Floridians. Now, you saw when the Manhattan grand jury came back in the hush money case, Donald Trump and his allies attacked that grand jury and said, well, these are just Manhattanites who didn't vote for me. But Floridians did vote for him. And yet there was a grand jury that found probable cause that he committed the crimes that are outlined in this indictment. It's not a witch
Christy,
hunt.
though, yeah, come on. You and I both know, though, that any decent prosecutor can get a grand jury to indict a ham sandwich. Now, when the ham sandwich is the former president of the United States, it's a little different. And I'll grant you that the indictment itself is pretty damning. I've yet to see a lawyer who just looks at it as a lawyer and says, this isn't a pretty meaty indictment as compared to the one in New York. Especially, it was clear that Jack Smith laid all that out. But as I think about this, May, also from just sort of the way Trump and you've been involved in the Trump White House as they were making defenses of things, I've really yet to hear any of Trump's attorneys make substantive legal arguments as to why what is in the indictment is not true, versus why it is politically motivated versus why it may not be exactly, sort of consistent with what's happened to other public figures, on and on and on. How much of any of that's admissible?
Yeah, a common defense strategy is really not just saying, I didn't do it, but saying you can't bring this case. I don't think that is unique to Trump. So if you were not authorized to do the search and find all of these documents, if you are not able to pierce attorney-client privilege and put all these things that Evan Corcoran is saying on the record and make your case that way, if the Espionage Act requires some sort of willful violation, some sort of intent to harm the United States, like none of those are I didn't do it. They're all you can't make the case. But this is legal defense 101 is, oftentimes Trump doesn't stick to that. So he goes with, I didn't do it. I never knew Stormy Daniels. I never saw Stormy Daniels. No idea who E. Jean Carroll is. Never saw her. Not my type. Like Trump is going to make the I didn't do it case, but I think his lawyers are going to probably stick to classic legal defense, which is, I'm not going to talk about that. I'm going to talk about how you can't bring this case.
Yeah, and then look, the standard that Jack Smith laid out was that the former president, put the country at risk, right? And that is much of a political argument as it is a legal one. In fact, I don't know what statute says you can't put the country at risk. It tends to that in and of itself was the political argument. Will Scharf, Republican running for Attorney General, former federal prosecutor as well, who's with us, running for Attorney General in Missouri. If you were the prosecutor, if you're Jack Smith in this, what are you most worried about the judge ruling on?
I'd be worried about a number of courts that have looked at the Espionage Act historically, including the Eastern District of Virginia, which is probably the district that sees the most of these most of these cases. Judges have found heightened mens rea requirements that basically require a degree of willfulness and intent that doesn't seem to be present on the face of the indictment. There's a case, I believe it's the Rosen case out of the Eastern District of Virginia, where Judge Ellis, who's an eminent jurist in this area of the law, basically found that you need to show a degree of intent to undermine national security or to benefit a foreign country with respect to a conspiracy charge that encompassed a conspiracy to commit a subsection E violation, which is what the president is accused of. If I'm Jack Smith, I'm very worried about getting bogged down in these sorts of legal arguments that could potentially overthrow the entire indictment and get this process really off the tracks very quickly. I'd also be worried about my search warrant holding up. As May said, I'd be worried about attorney-client privilege issues. Before you were talking about a grand jury having indicted, I'd note that the grand jury has only heard one side of the case, which is the prosecution's version of the facts and the prosecution's take on the law. Prosecutors routinely instruct grand jurors as to the nature and requirements of federal statutes when they bring cases in front of grand juries. So I think the fact that a grand jury returned an indictment here is unsurprising. I think the real question is going to be just exactly how the rubber meets the road once Trump's legal team starts filing motions, starts challenging evidence, and starts challenging.
Let me interrupt you for 1 second. Will, you make a great point, and that is even just listening to you, right? the depth of the legal machinations that are going to happen, how long that can take, goes into months, if not years, right? Because you've got motions and then arguments and then appeals of the appeals, and it just continues down. Something that President Trump, when he was a businessman, was legendary at, was drawing out litigation. Robert Sherman, our reporter on the ground outside the courthouse. Robert, what do you got?
Hey, Leland, just a few minutes ago, the former president's motorcade arrived here at the courthouse. The former president now has been officially booked in court, according to the U.S. Marshals Service. Something that we didn't know that was going to happen, though, Leland, he was accompanied not just by his legal counsel, but Walt Nauta, who has been listed allegedly as a co-conspirator in this case and is listed in 5 of those charges with the former president, counts 32 through 36. They contend that Nauta aided the former president in moving and concealing some of these documents and misleading investigators. So he is also in court today and will be sitting at the defense table with the former president. That's the latest that we have for you, Lethan, but we'll have more as we get it.
He's sort of been the enigma that no one really thought about in this case. This is the former valet. He was a member of the U.S. military, worked for the president at the White House, and then went into private life with the president. And became what in politics is called a body man, which is sort of the guy who does everything from adjust your collar to get you a Diet Coke to tell you who you're about to meet. Robert Sherman, great work. Interesting sort of that I guess at some point they would be having a co-defense, if you will, although that could change. No on Andrew this second. They're working on him. So we're going to go back now to May Malman. Typically, if you're a co-conspirator, if you will, has been identified by this indictment of the president and of his aide, his body man, the former president, is it unusual to have them arraigned together? And then at some point, is there a split in the defense possibly?
There should absolutely be a split in the defense if Walt knows what's good for him, because what you're trying to do is distance yourself from the crime. And oftentimes that means pushing as much of the crime onto your alleged co-conspirator as possible. But this is the peril and the problem of being a Trump staffer. And I've met Walt. I think he's an extremely nice, upstanding guy. I don't think that he has any intent to harm the United States. He's a Navy guy. But there is this effect that when you're around Trump, you want to serve him. You want him to like you. You want him to tell you you're doing a good job. And I think that there are too many Trump staffers that end up doing things out of the kindness, out of the goodness of their own heart, out of an act of service that end up tripping them up. And I fear that Walt is going to maybe discover that a little too late.
Yeah, and obviously there's been a number of former Trump staffers and one at least very specific Trump lawyer who's figured that out. We were talking about Michael Cohen. Now, just from a political standpoint, as we watch this, because what's playing out right now inside this courthouse is a very mundane and routine legal proceeding. And I'm watching every television network cover it pillar to post of something that we don't really know of what's happening. It's effectively a guy who walked into a building today to go see the federal judge. Now, he happens to be the former president of the United States, which makes this so different. But what do we make of the split in the Republican Party between those who are aggressively defending him, those who are saying that what he did was wrong, but he wouldn't be prosecuted if he was anybody other than Donald Trump, and then the people who are some of his rivals in the primary aggressively going after him?
Well, first of all, to start with your point, this is like a very ordinary day and a very extraordinary day wrapped in one, right? It's a mundane happening that involves an absolutely historic event. Now, on the politics, I think that also goes, Leland, to a point that you raised earlier, which is his conduct defensible? That's the big question politically and legally. The defense so far politically from Republicans has been, well, look at Hillary Clinton, look at Joe Biden, look at the fact that this is paralleled in other countries that we don't wish to emulate, like Cuba and Venezuela. But I think what we're seeing from someone like Nikki Haley, for example, is raising questions about, is the conduct criminal, or is it in some way defensible, or can it be rationalized away? And someone like Haley is clearly more willing, even than someone like Ron DeSantis, to make that point in a fairly pointed way, even in a party that is broadly loyal to former President Trump.
Vivek Ramaswamy, who's a long shot running for president, he was on the program last night. He was threading an awfully thin line of saying this was really bad judgment. And I said, okay, so if you were president and you stopped being president, which all presidents do, would you take documents with you as well? He goes, no, but that's because it's a judgment issue, not a legal issue, which say what you will. Joanna, when are we going to start seeing Democrats actively attack either A, Trump, which they haven't seemed to be doing much lately, or B, trying to attack those Republicans who are attempting to defend Donald Trump?
Well, Gavin Newsom was on last night for part of his 1-hour interview with Hannity, which was pretty interesting, actually. He was asked about it. He actually said nice things about President Trump with COVID. No one's going to defend him on this. And I think you're seeing, the Republican Party, look, in politics, it's a dangerous and awful thing that a lot of politicians will ask for absolute loyalty, and regardless of the law. Yeah. And when you see that in politics, my advice is always run. And this happens with Democrats and it happens with Republicans. And my hope is that what we're going to see is people start to come out and say, never cover up for anything that's bad, because like I mentioned before, President Biden is actually still being investigated by a special prosecutor. And so you've also got Chuck Grassley right now who's saying there's tapes of President Biden involved with Burisma, which if anything is true, then Democrats need to come out and say that that's wrong too.
This is what is there any realization we can, if what's in the indictment is true, and we have a graphic of the transcript of the tape, right? And this is the tape that was made while President Trump was allegedly talking to a book publisher and a writer, in which he talked about having this classified document that he didn't declassify as president. So it shows that he knew that he had the document. He knew that it was classified. He knew he wasn't supposed to show it to anybody, on and on and on. Fine. So if true, what was done in the indictment was bad, is there any discussion in Democratic circles of be careful what we wish for here? In that, yes, conceivably what was laid out in the indictment is illegal. But if you cross the Rubicon of your Justice Department investigating the opposing party's former president, eventually the shoe's going to be on the other foot.
It better be a high bar to meet. And look, Donald Trump was in office and he was the one who decided not to investigate or assign a special counsel to the Hillary Clinton situation with her emails. I do think that with President Trump, he had many opportunities to just turn over the documents, and this would never have proceeded. He didn't do that.
The other point, just to jump in and to jump off Johanna's point, is we all, of course, have got used to talking about the documents here. Obstruction, or rather conspiring to obstruct justice, is actually the single most serious charge here. And that goes beyond the issue of documents per se. It goes to his alleged attempts to conceal them. Now, of course, he'll have the chance to mount a defense and say that that didn't happen or that there were exonerating circumstances. But that is the central point of differentiation between his case and between any allegations that are floating around relating to President Biden.
That brings us to Ankush Khadori, former federal prosecutor at the Department of Justice on white-collar crimes, which this is sort of a weird part of the law, Counselor, if I have it right, that it is in a way white-collar because there's sort of nobody with a baseball bat beating anybody, but at the same time, it involves this very unique part of the law that relates to national security.
Yeah, this is an unusual case, right? These fact patterns don't come up that often. When they do, they tend to involve relatively low-level or obscure government officials. So to see a prosecution that is sort of keyed off of these statutes and this sort of underlying conduct at all is a little unusual. And of course, it's totally unprecedented as it concerns a former president.
When you heard Niall's explanation, and we always say it in Washington, right? It's not the crime, it's the cover-up that always gets you. And at a point, you know, a big part of this, the argument that will be made is, hey, look, that if President Trump had simply handed this stuff back, even if he had taken it, we all wouldn't be here right now. And the bounce for Republicans is, well, if you know that the world is out to get you, which President Trump clearly has learned over the past 6 or 7 years, that prosecutors are continuing to investigate him, why give anybody the opportunity on this? But that's a different story. Sticking sort of with the fact pattern as it is right now in this, you make the point low-level staffers who are normally involved in this. You think about Sandy Berger, you think about others. But you think also about General Petraeus and others who have been charged or looked at under this, Hillary Clinton. How much of that plays into what happens either before trial or what happens after trial if there is a conviction and then sentencing?
So I'm sure it already played some role in the decision to bring charges in the first place, right? Merrick Garland has said that in his Justice Department it is extremely important that like cases be treated alike, Democrats not differently treated than Republicans. At the pre-trial stage, I expect that Trump's lawyers may file some sort of a motion to dismiss the case on the basis of selective prosecution. That should not really get that far. But they may also try to develop sort of defense themes and evidence that they could try to use at trial to sort of suggest that maybe Trump wasn't intentionally breaking the law because he saw other people get away with it and he thought it was okay and that sort of thing. And then at the tail end of a prosecution, if there is a trial and there is a conviction, the judge will certainly have to take into account comparable cases and comparable prosecutions and the sentences that resulted in those cases. That's an obligation imposed upon the judge by statute, among the many other factors that judges need to consider during a sentencing.
The piece you wrote in Politico, fascinating piece. I would encourage anybody to read it. Opinion, how screwed is Trump? The former president faces his most serious legal threat to date, but he is hard at work on his most potent defense, his re-election bid. In that, if the election happens before the trial, it opens up all sorts of possibilities, right? Either that whoever does win pardons him, or that he himself wins. And if he wins, this case is effectively over, right?
Yeah, and that is still true even if there is a trial before next November, because any trial is followed by months usually of post-trial submissions on sentencing. The judge has to hold a sentencing hearing. There's almost certainly going to be appeal if that's the result, and Trump can stay out on bail pending an appeal if the judge approves it. So there are months that follow any kind of trial of this sort of complexity and magnitude, in which there's still litigation and people are still very much sort of free and out and about.
All right, so we've seen this over the past couple of major moments as it relates to a criminal investigation of Donald Trump. We saw it, obviously, after the Mar-a-Lago raid. We saw it after the New York indictment, and we're seeing it now, which is fundraising by the former president. In fact, I just got another email from Donald J. Trump himself. Friend, a rabid left-wing reporter accidentally revealed the true motive behind this sham indictment. She wondered if President Biden's Department of Justice would drop my indictment if I agreed to drop out of the 2024 presidential race. That's called extortion. That's how the mafia works, not America. I will never drop out of the presidential race. Please donate. And the buttons to donate are below. He continues to raise money out of this. May Malman, to you, is the Trump, have you detected in any way the Trump base, which you are now sort of adjacent to, of a tiring, if you will, of this?
I wish, and I do think that there is a caricature of the Trump base of facts don't matter. They'll, be loyal to him even if he shoots their firstborn. And I don't think that that's the case. I think that yes, he'll be able to fundraise off this. Yes, there's still loyalty. No, they're not tired yet. But don't mistake that for people won't move. And if this case moves forward and the other primary opponents are able to make some strategic shots, then maybe you've got something. But I think the problem with are people tired? Like, if somebody who you feel like is fighting for you is your leader, has been the only strength in the conservative movement since Reagan, and since then it's just all been weak leader after weak leader after weak leader, and then you see people attacking him because he's too strong. This is not the moment to get tired. This is the moment to rally up. And maybe you can get too many fundraising emails and finally exhaust out. But I don't know. I just think this is such a huge moment. Nobody has explained the Hillary Clinton situation sufficiently as different. You still got
and that's the point. That's one of the points that Ankush made in his piece in Politico, is that, like cases alike, there's all these different sort of standards that then factor into the conversation. But I guess that brings us to what's going to happen tonight, which is his speech at Bedminster. We saw this after the New York indictment, where he talked, and where he will speak again tonight. Ankush, we've watched him sort of put things on Truth Social. In fact, today he sort of talked about prosecutors may have planted these documents. That was his latest defense. But if you're his lawyers, how worried are you? And what perhaps, shall we say, riverbanks would you give him for tonight's speech?
Look, ideally, he would not be talking at all as a legal matter, much less commenting on the investigation. If he has to say anything or feels compelled to say something, I would say, I'm innocent of the charges, and my lawyers are going to establish that at trial, if it even gets there. But of course, there is like a very strange paradox here that underlies all this, which is, even though, Trump's constant railing and the truths and the insults of the prosecutors are like the textbook things you should not be doing in a criminal defense in a situation like this, those seem to be the things that he thinks are going to rally the base and potentially propel him back to office. And so I think there are these two competing impulses here. One is a legal one that I'm sure his lawyers are impressing upon him. The political one is entirely separate. And they only have so much control over what he has to do and say in that part of his life. But it complicates matters considerably for them, even though, I think from Trump's perspective, winning the election, as I wrote in my piece, is the best and simplest way out of this mess.
Yeah, and to be fair, anyone would sort of look at the president's behavior, both while he was running for office, in office, and now out of office, that he has chosen the political side of any argument rather than the legal side, and is always sort of, to your point, kind of been willing to trade off the better legal strategy for the better political strategy. Will Scharf, who's still with us, what do we make, and I thought this was an unusual part of the indictment, where Jack Smith put in specifically Donald Trump's comments about Hillary Clinton and the handling of classified documents. I'm sort of going back to 2016, is sort of this, was that sort of a prebuttal, if you will, to the argument about what about Hillary?
I think there are a couple things at play there, Leland. The first, I would note that Hillary wasn't the president. Joe Biden wasn't the president. And that's going to result in legal defenses being available to President Trump that wouldn't be available to them. In terms of the material in the indictment, I think that's one possible interpretation. I think my interpretation of the way that Smith structured the indictment was just to include as much material that could potentially speak to intent as possible. Because of the high mens rea, the willfulness requirements of the statutes under which he's indicted the president.
Well, perhaps none of us thought that we would get this bit of news as it relates to the indictment and now arraignment of Donald Trump at a federal courthouse in Miami. Robert Sherman is there, where Carrie Lake, who lost as a candidate for governor in Arizona, has shown up with her own bit of I guess, is it a request or is it a demand of fellow Republicans?
A request more than anything, Leland. I mean, as we all know, there are a few people who carry the mouthpiece for the former president more proudly than Kari Lake does, and we spoke with her for a few minutes. She told us that she believes that it's time for the other Republican candidates to get out of the race and for everybody to unify behind the former president, saying that you've seen the divisions amongst Republicans in Washington. You see some of the pollings indicate that there's, at the very least, an appetite for somebody else to be atop the poll. She's out here encouraging, including by name, some of these other Republican candidates, such as Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, to step aside and have the whole party unite around former President Trump. Is that going to happen or not? We don't know. But you're seeing other Republican candidates that are really trying to opportunistically capitalize on this moment here in different ways. I mean, you had Vivek Ramaswamy, who was out here earlier today, who was talking about the indictment and casting criticism towards it. Then you had former Ambassador to the UN, Nikki Haley, last night, who was saying that if what has happened that was unsealed in that indictment is true, then there should be accountability. So you are seeing a lot of Republican names, really starting to add their voices to what's been going on here. But Kari Lake down here on the ground, one of the latest ones, in order to say it's time to unite around the former president. That's what she says, anyways.
Well, that's what she says. There you go, Robert Sherman. You never know who you're going to meet outside a Trump arraignment. Thank you very much, Niall. Look, this is going to go on for months upon months upon months. We've heard President Biden over and over say, "I'm not going to talk about it. I'm not going to talk about it," on and on and on. If Donald Trump is the nominee, he's going to have to talk about it. What sort of plan or contingency planning is the White House doing on this?
I'm not sure about in terms of concentrated planning. I think that there is a perception that they can let this case speak for itself. So if Donald Trump, as is the case, is about to become the first former president ever to be arraigned on federal criminal charges, that can speak for itself. The New York case, I think, is a harder case to make because it's a flimsier case. The argument that that is a political effort can be more easily made by former President Trump's allies. But in this case, the evidence is compelling. I think we have to say, in fairness, it's a much stronger case than the Alvin Bragg case. Yeah. As I say, Mr. Trump will get the chance to push back on it. But the White House's perception is, let this go forward. Let people draw the judgments that they wish to from this case. There's no need to stir the pot from a political perspective.
May, you make the point, interestingly enough, about the stickiness, if you will, of President Trump's support. And I said this earlier today, that since the beginning of 2015, when he said that John McCain wasn't a war hero, he likes war heroes who don't get captured. I have anchored enough newscasts in which people predicted that this moment was the end of Republican support for Donald Trump, or this was the moment that the usual political rules, like getting twice indicted means you have to drop out of the race, will apply to Donald Trump. That has yet to happen. And I wonder if there's a discussion among the Trump skeptical Republicans of, we probably should approach writing Trump's political obituary because of these indictments with a little bit more humility and sense of history. That if it doesn't make him stronger, he at least survives it and fights another day. And at some point, we're all going to get pretty tired of sitting around and talking about, whatever the 14th motion is in this case, and go back to bickering about the usual politics at which President Trump excels.
Yeah, and I think that Republicans should look at history, and instead of Nikki Haley style, basically agreeing that Trump did bad and is generally unfit for office. Chris Christie basically says the same thing. Oh, I can't believe he took all these classified documents. Those critiques are not going to land, I don't think, successfully. Maybe you pull a couple of people over, but I think we've known for quite a long time that Trump took everything but the wall hangings from the White House with him. And sort of shuffled things around from time to time, as did Biden, and then you've got the Hillary Clinton standard, the Jim Comey standard. I think what you're going to have to say is, Trump had an opportunity to clean house at the FBI. He had all of the opportunity in the world to level the playing field. This is war, and I am the only person equipped to handle that war. I had hoped, and I voted for Trump, and I thought twice that he would be the person for us, and he has turned out not to be it. So vote for me, not because you hate Trump, but because I will defend Trump better. I will clean up the FBI. I will protect you. I think that's really the only case to make.
Yeah, we've sort of heard a little bit of that from Ron DeSantis. That's part of his argument. Vivek Ramaswamy went, a step further. I will pardon Trump, challenging every other Republican to agree to pardon Trump. On and on and on. We're now, 9 minutes away from the appointed hour of 3 p.m., which is when the arraignment begins inside the federal courthouse in Miami, where, as best we can tell from the pictures, there are a lot of police, fewer reporters, and even fewer protesters as folks mill around. Some supporters of the president, some those who don't particularly care for him. I want to bring in Anush Kadori once again, former federal prosecutor. And I think what Robert Sherman reported on is fascinating, which is that Walt Nauta, who is the former president's now body man, was valet at the White House, will be sitting with him at the defense table. Whether or not he has his own lawyers or not, we don't know. But just as we look at that one individual, how significant is he in this case, and how significant is he in today's proceedings?
So, of course, we're all going to be focused first and foremost on Trump. But with respect to Nauta and his relationship to this case, I mean, first, obviously the allegations concerning him are themselves quite a bit troubling. And he's alleged to have also been integrally involved in obstructing justice and misleading investigators. But, another element of including him in this indictment potentially is a strategic consideration, which is anytime you charge more than one person and you charge them in a conspiracy, you have the opportunity potentially to flip one of the other defendants against the main defendant. And that could be something that, the prosecutors are going to attempt to do here. That'll be harder than usual because he's accused of lying to the FBI. So that's not really an ideal cooperator. But it's something the government is almost always open to, in a case like this where, the principal defendant could mount a complex and significant defense.
All right. Will Scharf with us as well. At what point does somebody who is a co-conspirator in an indictment like this, who's clearly the much smaller fish, if you will, when you talk about a prosecution, at what point do they get their own lawyer and then have to sort of break off the case?
It depends case by case. My assumption is that the special counsel's team has already tried to apply immense pressure to Walt Nauta to get him to cooperate, to get him to turn against President Trump. I think the fact that he's showing up to the courthouse alongside President Trump speaks volumes for the effectiveness of those efforts. If you're Walt Nauta right now, you're looking at two different paths. If you think crimes were committed by other people but not by you, then maybe you do look to separate your defense out and cooperate. If you think the whole thing is just a garbage indictment, though, which Walt may very well believe, then I think you stick it out with the president and his team and try to go the distance here.
Yeah, and you have to think that President Trump, who's been known to be a very effective lobbyer of his staff, and engenders a lot of loyalty by his staff. Any fair reading would say that, may have applied a certain amount of pressure, or at least given Walt his thoughts on this. I'm wondering if Christy Greenberg is still with us. Yes, Christy is still with us. Christy, bring you back in here. What we're going to watch today, what's happening inside the courthouse is sort of beyond routine. Then starts the motions, the pretrial motions, motions to quash evidence, motions to dismiss, on and on and on and on. If a defense attorney really wants to string things out, and there's some complicated questions of law, which this indictment brings up, how long are we talking about that we could be going through more and more hearings and more motions involving this case long before we get to a trial?
Well, one thing to point out is the Southern District of Florida is one of those districts that has a rocket docket. Things are supposed to move very quickly in the Southern District of Florida. However, I would expect that Trump's lawyers will look to delay for various reasons. Among them, he's got a new legal team, and they're going to take some time to get up to speed. You're also dealing with classified documents, which they're going to want to review, and there are protocols about how to do that, whether or not the former president respected those. His lawyers need to in this process. And then they're going to look to make their motions once they've reviewed the discovery. And among those motions that I would imagine they would make would be challenging the search warrant affidavit and also challenging the rulings from the District Court of the District of Columbia judge about attorney-client privilege and piercing the attorney-client privilege so that we could get those communications, which are featured prominently in the indictment to support the obstruction charge. So those are all things that are going to take some time. And again, his lawyers are going to look to delay. Special counsel Jack Smith has said he wants a speedy trial. The public is entitled to it, and that is under the Constitution. There is a speedy trial, so we'll see what Judge Kanan does.
Yeah, and Kush, at the same time, right, that a former president, and you pointed out, I think in your Politico piece, that in every way that this is such an unprecedented case, whether or not the former president was granted any deference by the Justice Department, we don't know. But typically, in the end, it's the defendant's rights that the judge is at least more willing to protect, and in one kind of case like this. So you make the point he's running for his life. He's running for president for his life, because if he wins, this thing all goes away. Is it reasonable to think that we could still be talking about pretrial motions as we're talking about the presidential debates?
You mean the primary debates or the general election debates?
I was talking the general election debates.
It's possible that this could still be in a pretrial phase then. You have to also bear in mind that, as Christy noted, the classified element of this does introduce some complexities. There are also potential avenues for interlocutory appeals, and those are interim appeals before there's a trial. And the judge may be more willing than usual to grant that sort of appeal, given the significance of the defendant, the proceeding, and the issues. So I would not be terribly surprised if, come next summer, this case is not going to trial. Like, there's going to be a big question hanging over that, right? One issue is, if you're thinking about scheduling this trial, you might say to yourself when you're the judge, well, I want to steer clear of kind of interfering with an ongoing political process, whether that's the primaries or the general election. On the other hand, to my mind, I think there's a very credible argument to say, well, if he's really running for re-election, the American people actually should know the result of this proceeding, or at least the trial phase of this proceeding, before they're potentially casting ballots to put him back in office.
Yeah, and also in terms of sort of at least have answers to some of the big questions that'll be brought up in the pretrial motions, as if we haven't heard enough or talked enough about the case here. We're right now 1 minute ahead, or away, I should say, from when they are supposed to gavel court in at the Miami federal courthouse for the arraignment of Donald Trump. We understand that his aide, Walt Matta, is with him right now as well to hear the charges against him, which is contained in the same indictment. A few fewer charges against the aide than there are against President Trump. Special coverage continuing here on NewsNation. Sean Spicer, President Trump's former spokesman, is with us. Mick Mulvaney, the former president's chief of staff, back during the White House years with us. Johanna Mosca here. Niall Stanage as well, White House columnist for The Hill, with us as well. It's a long list. Anish Kadori, former DOJ prosecutor who worked on white-collar crimes. Christy Greenberg, former federal prosecutor. Will Scharf, May Malman as well. And you'll get to see all of these people over the coming hour here as we take a look outside the Miami federal courthouse. Important to note at 3 o'clock, and this is H hour when the president is going to be arraigned. His Secret Service detail brought him from the Doral about an hour ago. that as best we can tell from the pictures you're looking at and then some other pictures we have, that police currently outnumber reporters and they all outnumber the protesters. So the idea that there was going to be some big event surrounding this or violence or mass protests or some huge situation seems to have not materialized in the same way it didn't materialize in New York during the indictment and then the arraignment in New York. This being a federal case, a little different, a lot more security outside of a federal courthouse just by its nature. The other thing to point out, for those of you just joining us, is that you're seeing the same pictures we see. And by that, I mean in New York, we had a camera inside the courthouse, and then there were cameras allowed inside the courtroom, which delivered the famous picture of President Trump sitting as a defendant at the table. We're not going to see any of that. Reporters who've gone into the courthouse to cover this have to relinquish their phones. Thus, no one will take any pictures surreptitiously. So where the president exactly is inside the courthouse, we don't know. We understand that he is going to be fingerprinted or already has been fingerprinted, but is not going to be handcuffed, and there will be no mugshot. Sean Spicer with us right now, former President Trump's White House spokesperson when he was at the White House. Sean, Anush made a very good point earlier, which is that tonight's speech is the chance for the president not only to speak about these charges legally, but speak about them politically. And at the same time, he'll have to speak about them politically and try to convince voters that it's as much about him as it is about them. And we hear over and over from Republican voters, they're tired of the long list of grievances from President Trump. What is the balance? We're now 5 hours away from the former president actually talking about this. How much is he going to listen to his lawyers, and how much is he going to listen to his political operatives?
You know, Leland, I think you're asking the right question. As you know, when covering President Trump, that's all going to depend on what he thinks in the half hour before he gives that speech. I think there'll be a lot of discussion on the plane ride back. I imagine it's 2.5, 3 hours from Miami back to New Jersey. He'll have the lawyers and the folks on the plane with him. My guess is that's where a lot of these decisions are going to get made. He's going to share his thoughts, but you're going to have a back and forth. My guess is between the lawyers and the comms people who are trying to say, look, this is your opportunity. You're going to have all these networks carrying you live. This is an opportunity to share with people why you think this is sort of, as you call it, a witch hunt, and why you think that you have the right policies to lead the country again. Because if I were him, I wouldn't just use this to talk about the events of today, but I would use this opportunity, which is rather unprecedented in the middle of a campaign to have this kind of media attention, to talk about the bigger issues at stake. My guess is that he does weave in some hits on Biden, and this becomes a talk about how they failed to prosecute so many folks on the left who have had issues.
The whataboutism defense, I think, plays pretty well with sort of diehard Republican voters. And that's what the president's in right now. The former president's in a primary fight. He's not in a general election fight. But the people who are outside the courthouse don't need any convincing about the case. Have you heard from Trump world, is there any discussion of, hey, when are we going to have to pivot to the same kind of message that we had in 2016? You were there. It was a lot more about working class Americans than it was everybody's out to get me, Donald Trump.
Well, the distinction, by the way, I mean, 2016, you're running as a challenger. People don't know you. You're trying to lay that out. I think that the difference now is that he can say, look, I was your president. I fought for you. I delivered for you. And they're preventing me from coming back to shake up the system. And I think that's the message that I would try to fight for, to say, look, you got to be talking about them. You're right in the sense that the elections are about, one, the future, and two, about voters. They don't care about you. They want to know that you are going to fight for them and get results. That's where I think Trump has to make sure that, I mean, the way you put it, pivot, but it's making sure that he's talking about these events and these charges in the context of preventing him from solving problems and addressing issues that voters care about him. That being said, I will take issue with what you, hold on one second. I just want to say this.
Yeah.
I think that when the press largely, and this is who it is, uses that phrase, whataboutism, this isn't some made up thing. The reality is, and I am, just for the record, not excusing anybody who mishandles classified information. I do think that that should be taken extremely seriously, both in terms of the storage and the handling of it. That being the case, you can't tell me that Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden and others, I mean, Biden's had this stuff for years in multiple places. You want to talk about Mar-a-Lago, he had boxes by a Corvette in an open garage. This phrase that the media uses, whataboutism, is an excuse for them to not address the wrongdoings of folks on the left.
Yeah, no, look, it's a fair point, and Merrick Garland is going to have to answer for this concept that he's laid out, right? Which is like cases are treated alike, and at some point have to justify, right. I think, Sean, to your point, and to a larger point, to a lot of voters. And I hear from a lot of people who do not like Donald Trump, but they like less this feeling that there is a double standard, and it is not necessarily
right. We're seeing it play out in these national polls where people are saying, do I think what he did was right? No. But do I think that the charges are politically motivated? Yes. And I think that that's the issue. You're absolutely right that most of the people at that courthouse and 25% or so of voters are with him and think that this is completely politically motivated. But I think you're also right that there's a lot of people in the middle that say, gosh, I don't entirely like Trump, but I believe that they're weaponizing the system to go after him because they didn't do the same with several folks on the left.
Yeah, no, and the political argument there is a powerful one. We saw Jack Smith in the indictment, the special counsel, sort of trying to almost pre-buttle that with putting in quotes from then candidate Donald Trump in 2016. But I think this is an important point. Just as we're watching this, the front runner for the Republican nomination for one of the two major parties in America and a former president of the United States has just now pled not guilty to federal felonies, and he's facing potential jail time. And we are in, as much as you want to say, uncharted territory, we're in uncharted territory now. And I thought the point that Sean brought up is an important one, that there is this big delta of Americans who do not like Donald Trump and don't like his behavior, but at the same time think that these are politically motivated charges and don't like that much either. Is there any discussion at the White House and among Democrats of, we may have a real problem with this gap of swing voters who are kind of offended that for the first time in 200 plus years, we're going to possibly throw a former president in jail when it may not, when there's some real questions about what motivated the prosecution?
So there are a couple of concerns like that, Leland, and I think that you've articulated them well. There is the historically unprecedented nature of this, which has been avoided in previous instances. I mean, President Ford pardoning Nixon obviously isn't an exact parallel. It was two people from the same party. But nonetheless, the idea that it isn't good for the country to prosecute a former president. Then there's the question of, is it specifically targeting former President Trump? Does he bring up a particular animus? Now, the point that I would make is there is a, not exactly a counter-argument, but a counterweight. And it's not about people necessarily always finding the former president unacceptable. It's about the Trump fatigue issue. Yeah. Do we as a nation want to go through all of this drama that he always brings in his wake again and again? Does that serve as a sort of political antidote to the points that you're making?
The fact that we've learned, and look, President Trump, as we have said now a number of times, defies political reality. The idea that you would have every cable news network and the broadcast networks going wall to wall with coverage of you being brought to a federal courthouse, and the idea that that conceivably could help you politically because it has in the past, is a totally different thought than we've ever had in American politics. And I think that's a point that Anish Kadori made, former federal prosecutor who's with us, a great piece in Politico Ankush, if I read it right, I think what you're looking at here is that the harder President Trump runs politically on this issue, the more difficult in a way it makes it for prosecutors and for the Justice Department.
Yeah, that's right, and the court, right? Because he's saying things that could throw a wrench in the proceeding, that could actually produce admissions or statements that are not even helpful for him, that could be used against him at trial. He may stir up some trouble amongst his supporters and that sort of thing. And, I do think he's likely to emphasize this sort of question of whether or not there's a double standard. But I have to say, just in response to Mr. Spicer's comments, I find these comparisons to Hillary Clinton and the like extremely facile and misleading. There is nothing in the fact pattern regarding Hillary Clinton or Joe Biden that remotely approximates the alleged obstruction on the part of former President Trump. The elaborateness of it, the number of people involved, just the playing games, the using his lawyer to mislead the government, nothing like that has ever been uncovered with respect to any of these other people. So I understand that people in the public are sort of ingesting that message and perhaps responding in that way in response to polls. But our responsibility here right now is to tell people the truth and give them accurate information and not just to deliver political talking points.
No, look, there's an important point in terms of also just sort of how much in general the American people can digest. I think, Sean, that may at times benefit President Trump in this, right? Because I think fair reading that this isn't just about having documents. This is about not giving them back. This is about allegedly telling your lawyers to lie about it. This is about holding up documents and saying, these are classified documents. I'm not supposed to have them. I'm not supposed to show them to you, but I have them, as allegedly seen on tape. But in a way, and I'll give you the last word here, that the fact that the waters can be so muddied about Joe Biden and about Hillary Clinton, and muddied with good reason, and muddied with people who also behaved poorly, that actually works in the president's favor, even if the facts aren't necessarily the same.
Well, I think the point you're bringing up is a good one, but it works both ways. I mean, look, I think the one thing again, and I just want to emphasize, I don't condone in any way, shape, or form anybody mishandling or misstoring classified information. It's for a reason, to protect our sources and methods, our strategies, our plans, and our people. But that being said, the intent is not the issue. I've been around classified information for 24 years with the clearance. It's not about your intent. It's about whether you mishandle it or not. And I think that's the nut of this. The other factor, and this gets back to your muddying question, is that the president is the only one of the aforementioned people that actually has the Presidential Records Act as part of his defense, that can say, I had this because I was entitled to it under the Presidential Records Act. I believe that, for this reason or that reason. I'm not trying to play judge or jury on this, but I think that that's one aspect that's not getting fully discussed, that his attorneys will play for, which is what did he have the right to retain? And I think that's going to hopefully play into that defense. But I think that muddies it against him, because for a lot of these discussions that we're having, it's seemingly a very binary thing. Should he have had it or shouldn't he have? There are reasons that because he served as president of the United States at the time that material was in Florida, he had the right to have it, and potentially had the right to have it afterwards. That's going to muddy the discussion against him. So I think there's variables that benefit him probably in this discussion because he can point to others, but then there's also elements of this that I think are going to work against him because people just don't understand all the various statutes that are at play here.
Yeah, that's a good. Yeah, and the fatigue that sets in just in general is real, for sure. As interesting sort of as the discussion is, and then sort of the wildness of the pictures. Sean, we know you got to run. Thanks for hopping on with us. We appreciate it. And we'll check back in the next couple days for sure. Christy Greenberg, former federal prosecutor. I saw you shaking your head a little bit, which I understand. But I think Sean brings up a pretty interesting point, right? That at some point there's the legal question, and these are all really important legal arguments, Presidential Records Act, and whether, what records need to be kept and what records are allowed to be kept, and can he declassify and can he? But in the court of public opinion, which is at least right now where this is playing out, a lot of what you believe sort of goes back to what you think about Donald Trump.
So I just want to respond to two things that Sean said. First, he said intent doesn't matter. Intent is everything. This is a criminal case. This is not a persecution. This is a criminal prosecution. And his intent is key to whether or not he committed a crime, whether or not his retention of these very sensitive materials with our nation's secrets, whether or not he was permitted to do that. He clearly was not. This is cut and dry. Once he ceased to be president, these classified materials, he had no authority to keep them. And he knew that. The indictment is riddled with statements where he is saying, I know I can't have this. I know I'm not entitled to keep these classified documents. I could have declassified them when I was president. They're secret now. I didn't do it. And so, you know, his knowledge and his intent is key here. The other piece is that, again, these are really sensitive and important documents, and the risk to national security of mishandling them, that would have to be something that the public, I would hope, would understand. Keeping classified documents in a bathroom, in a shower, in a ballroom where people are holding weddings, you know, there's a tremendous national security risk. And
right, well,
you know,
I think that's why Jack Smith laid things out in the way he did, right? I mean,
absolutely.
the fact
photos,
this was a pretty deep indictment. We should point out, and I think it's only fair to point out, when you see the photos in the indictment, it's easy to think, oh, all of those boxes are filled with classified documents. They're not. There was 100 or 105 classified documents, all of which would fit in one of those boxes. So the concept that, you know, the treasure trove of America's secrets was in the Mar-a-Lago ballroom may not also be entirely accurate. Mick Mulvaney with us, the former chief of staff to the then President Donald Trump, with us. A fascinating thing just crossed. J.D. Vance is going to announce plans to place a hold on all of Biden's nominees for the Justice Department. J.D. Vance is the junior senator from Ohio. This is Elena Treen reporting. But I can't help but think, Mick, that we're almost sort of going back to 2015 in a way, of the fight among Republicans, those who support Donald Trump, those who don't like Donald Trump, and then in the middle is this weird hybrid of people who sort of have to admit that they don't necessarily support the president, but they're more angry at the idea that a former president or a leading Republican candidate could face jail time.
Yeah, I think there's a certain truth to that. There's a certain, maybe part of the Republican Party never embraced Donald Trump that much in the first place. Loved the policies, couldn't stand the guy. But put yourself in the shoes of just an ordinary person who doesn't follow politics that much. And they're not a lawyer. And the last time I checked, I don't think Sean is either. I am, but I'm not a criminal lawyer, so I try not to talk about stuff I don't know that much about. Go to an ordinary citizen and you hear the word Espionage Act and you think to yourself, wait a second, who got the documents? What's the harm here? I don't think we can, it's not wrong to emphasize that, because I think ordinary citizens look at this and go, look, I don't like this guy. He shouldn't have had these documents. Goodness gracious, it looks terrible to put him in the bathroom. But where's the harm? Apparently, the only people that we know that he showed them to was staffers on 2 occasions. He didn't sell it to the Chinese. We don't think that a foreign intelligence service got a hold of these documents. He didn't try to sell the documents, didn't try and benefit from this. Did he screw up? Yeah. Did he break the law? It looks like he probably did. But I think an ordinary American is asking themselves at some point, maybe folks who don't, if they love Donald Trump, they know what they think. If they hate Donald Trump, they know what they think. But the folks in the middle are thinking, right, what's the harm here? Is this really the reason we put the president behind bars?
Right. Is this the reason that we all of a sudden cross the Rubicon and charge a former president of the United States, which is a big deal, with a crime and the potential front-runner for the Republican nomination, or the current frontrunner for the Republican nomination, put him in jail? The other person I think is fascinating in this whole thing is Walt Nauta, who is the Trump aide, who's also listed in this indictment, who was in the courthouse with President Trump to answer for these felony charges. He faces far fewer charges. We understand President Trump has pled not guilty now, and now we wait for him to come out, because as we heard from Will Scharf, that these proceedings are normally pretty quick. Will, I think this is an interesting point, right, of the normal person standard going, wow, this is sort of unlike anything we've ever heard. This is way sort of more than what would be typical to most former presidents, or even to a lot of people that we've heard. You take the Hillary Clinton standard, you take the current Joe Biden standard, on and on as it relates to these documents. If those arguments are going to be made in court, when are they made? Who are they made to?
Yeah, I think that may be a jury argument more than anything else. One thing I would note, though, to an ordinary American citizen, why bring this case now? Why not wait until after the presidential election is over? I mean, that's one of the most unprecedented aspects of this. Department of Justice policy is typically not to bring new indictments or commit overt investigative acts during the pendency of an election for exactly the reason that we're discussing, which is the appearance of impropriety, the appearance of political motives. DOJ could have avoided that entire issue by just sitting on this and waiting to indict, after the presidential election. And I think that's at the root of a lot of the very real concerns we're hearing from around the country right now.
Yeah, it's a good. There is this sort of feeling about even sort of independent voters that I talk to around the country saying, "Hey, where is this sort of concept that the Department of Justice doesn't put its hand on the scale?" And I keep going back to this. President Biden keeps saying, "I've never talked to anybody about this. I've never said a word about a case." The fact of the matter is that Jack Smith works for Merrick Garland, who's the Attorney General. Merrick Garland works for Joe Biden. Is it possible to have a decision to charge a former president of the United States with a crime that is usually subject to an awful lot of prosecutorial discretion without the acknowledgement that the decision whether or not to charge somebody who's a former president, who's now running for president, is inherently a political one?
No matter how you slice it, for the reasons you described, these people ultimately report up to the president and serve at his pleasure when you run the lines of authority. However, the appointment of the special counsel was designed to respond to the fact that Trump is an active presidential candidate when he announced shortly after the midterms. And just one point of clarification, the Justice Department does not have a policy to never commence a criminal prosecution if there's an ongoing election. There's an informal policy to steer clear 30 to arguably 60 days out ahead of a scheduled election. Donald Trump announced his candidacy shortly after the midterms, right? November of last year. That was not some license for him, or license of impunity for 2 years, potentially, while he's running for re-election. So I understand why people are concerned about the political elements of it. Some of them were introduced by Trump, I think, on purpose.
All right, Ankush, pardon us for 1 second. I want to bring back in Robert Sherman, who's outside the courthouse. Do we understand, Robert, that the hearing's over yet?
We're not certain about that. Of course, all this information is coming in piece by piece, Leland. I do have a couple of pieces of color in order to give you. So looking at that booking process that the former president went through, as you said, it's like the second moon landing. We know for a fact that no mugshot was taken. We also know, coming from his legal counsel, that there was some kind of an arrangement made in which they said former president, not a flight risk or anything of that kind. So a bit of a drift from the norm for an everyday citizen. But of course, this is the former president we're talking about. And we did just hear Walt Nauta, who we did not know was going to be at court today, has now formally entered a plea of not guilty as well. Again, no surprises here, but the formalities are going through the process as we speak.
Yeah, Johanna, bring you back here in on this. I think Ankush made a really good point, right? Which is that it is impossible to look at this situation and have it not be political.
Right.
It just inherently is. At some point, is Joe Biden saying, I'm honest, I've never asked Merrick Garland to indict or not indict anybody, enough from the president?
Well, I think he's going to have those at the Justice Department explain the procedures. Look, this is highly unusual.
He hasn't had anybody explain the procedures. He didn't have Jack Smith explain it.
Which is why I was saying earlier with Niall, I was saying, I do think it would be to their benefit to show that there's another special counsel investigating the Bidens over the classified documents. There's an ongoing investigation in which they are not getting in the way of any of the Hunter Biden investigation. Look, I think the other thing that we need to be conscious of is we're going into an election year in which the RNC has already said so doubt on whether President Trump would be on stage on that debate stage. So we don't know whether, President Biden will have to actually take him on in a debate like that. The other thing is, I just don't understand, Leland, on these swing voters, who is it who didn't vote for Trump last time, who by basis of this is deciding they want to vote for Trump this time? And that's the big issue that Republicans have. If they don't have a different candidate, I don't know how they draw anyone else into the process.
No, it's a great point. Mick Mulvaney, with that, where are we, Mick, in the debate among Republicans about how far sort of a section of the Republican Party is willing to go to actually take Donald Trump on? Members of Congress or not, Republicans in Congress or not, there's a few Republican presidential candidates who seem to be willing to. But I know you're Trump skeptical, to say the least, but a fair reading of this says that this is the guy who still is the de facto king of the Republican Party.
Well, I think that's fair. He's certainly the highest ranking Republican. He's a former president of the United States, for goodness sakes, and he's running for president again. I think what you're seeing in the party is probably mirrored in the polling data you see for Donald Trump, which is there's probably 35 to 40% of the Republican primary voters who are absolutely solidly with Donald Trump. Regardless, I've seen numbers that as high as many as 50 or 60% of the voters don't think that their opinion of Donald Trump could be changed one way or the other by the outcome of this trial. I think that probably carries through to Congress. You've got some really hardcore Trump supporters. You've got a large group of people who sort of just wish he would go away. Many of them are in the Senate. And you've got a very small group of folks who are interested and willing to come out and actively attack him. I mean, look what you've got in the Republican field for president. You could go down the list and say, okay, every single one of the candidates is in one of those three camps. So it's amazing how the government sometimes does reflect the people.
Yeah, and you're now sort of watching these sort of parallel worlds play out. And Mick, this is what I can't ever figure out about Donald Trump, and I've been covering him now for 7 years.
There's only one, Leland. There's only one thing.
Oh well, look, there's a long list, but the one that I think is the most important and salient here is you look at this picture of a presidential candidate, the leading presidential candidate, being indicted for mishandling of all things classified documents. The idea that would not be political death in any other circumstance is kind of wild, and for any other person. The fact that it's Donald Trump, we know Trump defies political sort of rules, for lack of a better term, and political history. I'm wondering what the real warning should be, not only to Republicans, but also to sort of the Republican donor class, about those who are willing to try and say this is the end of Donald Trump, in the same way they said this was the end of Donald Trump, going all the way back to John McCain isn't a war hero and the hits all the way through.
Yeah. And Access Hollywood, look, part of it is Donald Trump. There's no question about it. But part of it is where we're living right now. I mean, if you over the course of the weekend, if you looked at some of the networks in this country, they had a parade of former Department of Justice people on television telling you how dangerous Donald Trump was. He was a threat to democracy. He was, they were comparing him to fascist leaders from the mid 20th century. Those folks used to work at the Department of Justice. If there's folks in there today that have that same attitude, is it possible? Is it possible that Donald Trump is being targeted? Certainly it looks like he's being targeted in the Manhattan case, with a district attorney who said, elect me and I'll prosecute Donald Trump. So it's never going to be one simple explanation, right? Some of it, yes, is Donald Trump. He's a truly unique figure, a unique political figure. I don't know what he is, but he's certainly his own thing. But it's also the environment we live in. You don't get here with only, it's sort of like a plane, when a plane crashes, Leland, it's never one or two things that go wrong. Yeah. It's 14 or 15 things that happen to go wrong. And that's where we are right now. It's not just Donald Trump. It's a lot more than that.
Yeah, no, it's a great point. Christy Greenberg with us right now. former federal prosecutor. You know better than anybody that the way an indictment reads versus sort of the way the case to the jury ends up getting presented is oftentimes very different. Not to mention that the defense gets to present a case, they get to question witnesses on and on and on and on. Just in terms of the machinations of bringing a case like this, I'm almost wondering if the possibility exists in people's minds of, especially prosecutors, this is the beginning. You indict a former president, you sort of hit, you almost, you fire a starter's gun, if you will. You really have no idea where this trial will actually end up, do you?
Well, I think the indictment, given that it is not just a bare bones indictment of stating the charges, but it is a speaking indictment. They are not just telling you, they are showing you. There are pictures, there are text messages, there are audio recordings, there are the attorney's notes walking you through conversations that Donald Trump had. More importantly than anything else, you've got Donald Trump's own words about what he understood about the protection of classified information, that it mattered, and all of the things that he was looking to do to avoid giving them back in response to the requests from the National Archives and in response to a grand jury subpoena. So I think, the indictment almost reads like a movie script. You can see how this will all be brought to life at trial because so much of it, with photographs, with text messages, with surveillance footage, the jury will be able to see. The other piece that I think will be really important to make clear at the trial is the question that Mick raised about what is the harm here. And the harm in at least the two identified incidents in the indictment is not just, sharing that classified information with staffers, which he did, who did not have security clearance, but sharing it with the media, sharing it with a PAC representative, and keeping them unsecured so that individuals from potentially foreign intelligence, our enemies, could go to Mar-a-Lago, know that it was unsecured, and have access to our nation's secrets. We know of at least one example where there was a Chinese national who was charged and sentenced to 8 months in prison, trespassing at Mar-a-Lago during the Trump presidency, had photographs, had all kinds of hard drives trying to seek out information. So, do we know the harm that could have...
It's a great point. I think I took a little bit different view, which is when Jack Smith, who gave that very short media statement, not much of it was about the law, right? It was sort of laying out his thinking in a way about why we needed to prosecute this crime. And I keep coming back to the line where he said, Jack Smith, quote, Donald Trump put the country at risk. Never said, and they don't seem to have the evidence to go the next step and say somehow national security was actually damaged, or that the war plans were shown and then published, or that next thing. They would have said that in the indictment. We're looking right now, I believe this is the exit from the federal courthouse where President Trump's motorcade will head out. He's pled not guilty, and his aide has pled not guilty. Will Scharf, to you, how long after the bell tolled at 3 o'clock when the not guilty plea came, now 3:34, how long till this is over and we can all do something other than stare at the federal courthouse in Miami?
Well, I'm enjoying being with you, Leland, and you've got some great guests on, so there's no better way to spend an afternoon. It really just depends. My assumption is that in a case like this, they'll look to move the president pretty expeditiously out of the courthouse. But as you know, any presidential movement is controlled in part by the Secret Service, and you have issues of cooperation between the Secret Service and local law enforcement. So we may be in for a bit of a wait, but it certainly sounds like all of the substantive proceedings are done, that everything went according to plan as we expected. And we'll see what happens.
Yeah, and also we should point out that when the president arrived at the courthouse now about an hour and a half ago, they shut down all the roads in Miami for him, which is unusual because normally when the former president drives around, he drives around in a couple of unmarked SUVs and in normal traffic and drives basically as if he was a private citizen, with surrounded by 10 or 12 Secret Service agents. So clear in Miami, they're sort of dealing with this a little bit differently. We're obviously watching to see the exit from the courthouse. Niall, to you, what is the calculation by Democrats right now to not spike the football? And I say that judiciously when I say Democrats, because there's the balance between the elected Democrats, if you will, speaking, the administration, and then Democrats in Congress, versus the Democrat punditry class, which I think, Johanna, you'd agree, is gleeful today. Almost where's the chips and beer?
I don't know. You go, Niall.
I mean, I think that in relation to spiking the football, the argument is the touchdown will already be scored, whether we spike the football or not. The touchdown is the blanket coverage of these very serious charges. That is the thing that Democrats think will speak for them. The spiking of the football risks, what's the football penalty? Excessive celebration or whatever?
Yeah, unsportsmanlike conduct.
Yeah, you got to give me a bit of a break in my transatlantic views of American football.
I don't know how they call it in rugby, but there you go.
But I will say,
Yeah.
on the political punditry class, I think the thing they're missing is, this is going to go to a jury. And in truth, I don't know if you can find a group of people in America, if you get a reasonable group that doesn't have one person who would say Trump can shoot someone in broad daylight and do no wrong. And so, I think that pundits actually need to be very cautious of stirring the pot. And so I do think you're right. There are some on other networks who are saying, oh my God, this is fantastic. We've got him. It's all solved. And it's not. It's going to a trial.
And just to add to that point of Johanna's, Leland, one scenario, not to get too far ahead of ourselves, but one scenario that we haven't...
we still have another 20 minutes.
Well, then I'll plunge on into the future. What in a scenario where Mr. Trump is found not guilty in these cases, then what happens?
Yeah, no, look,
politically
and I think that's what we sort of brought up. The idea is that, that when the indictment is the starter's gun. This is the beginning, not the end. And Will, I think that's a fascinating question to pose to you, which is, how do you get a jury of 12 people in southern Florida who go, no, never heard of Donald Trump, got no opinion whatsoever of the guy?
Yeah, the voir dire process is supposed to result in an unbiased jury. Certainly a lot of the public statements that have been made by Democrat office holders, by some of Donald Trump's political opponents, will make that tougher, as will, on the other side, statements made by President Trump's supporters. So for both the defense and the prosecution, voir dire, if it comes to that, and selecting a jury is going to be a difficult process. But you have cases, high-profile public cases like this all the time, all over America, where you have issues with biased jury pools, and our system is supposed to be able to address that.
Yeah, and at some point, I can't imagine a more high-profile trial than a former president, I guess with the exception maybe of OJ.
Well, that's...
I'll say this,
got
Leland.
similar coverage.
In my experience, jurors tend to be pretty able to focus on the facts in front of them, focus on what's been alleged and the evidence that's been introduced. We've seen a lot of high-profile jury trials in the last couple years. You think back to Kyle Rittenhouse and cases like that that had similar blanket wall-to-wall coverage, where I think juries did a very good job of discerning what the real facts were based just on the evidence presented in court. And that's an important point when you think about the indictment that's been filed. The special counsel's team is going to have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt everything that they've alleged. And that standard, beyond a reasonable doubt, it's a cornerstone of our legal system. It can be a challenging standard to meet, even in the best of times. I think we've only heard the first act of this case, and I think the second and third acts are likely to be a lot more favorable to the president than the first has been.
And it's important to point out that the jury may not hear, at least if the president's lawyers have their way, the jury inside this courthouse in Miami, whenever that occurs, may not hear everything that's in the indictment. There's a lot that may be thrown out. There conceivably, and I bring Christy in on this, conceivably, and just based on the way we read the indictment, Jack Smith likely put in everything that he had. It would be hard to imagine that there's an ace in the hole that he's held out, and therefore he's having his case picked apart by the media, only to, in a couple of months, go, oh, by the way.
So I actually think it's the opposite. There's been public reporting on this, and it's what I would suspect to be the case anyway, that there is a lot more that is not in this indictment. That he really was looking to focus on things that would not necessarily be coming from human sources, but really coming from, evidence that was in the form of, that's incontrovertible, things like photographs, things like surveillance footage, things that are much more concrete. We know he and his team have interviewed pretty much everybody that works at Mar-a-Lago. They have put in the grand jury various national security advisors and former White House officials. Those statements are not in this indictment, but it is surely part of the evidence that was relied upon in securing an indictment. So I expect we will see much more in the way of evidence as this case goes forward.
Yeah, and then we also see the evidence that the former president will present, which he's entitled to a defense and to be able to have witnesses and cross-examine the witnesses involved. One of them might be his former aide. And whether or not the prosecution's able to flip Walt Nauda, who was at the White House with President Trump and then moved to Mar-a-Lago as an employee. Look, President Trump, we understand he's going to leave the courthouse in the next couple of minutes. The arraignment has wrapped up. And what I think is fascinating is it's deja vu all over again, right, Mick? That he leaves the courthouse, as he did in New York, drives to the airport. We're going to watch the motorcade drive to the airport. And he flies somewhere, and then he gives a speech tonight, 8 o'clock tonight or so. Obviously, coverage here will continue of the speech. But this is a unique opportunity, right? Even for a former president, even for the front runner of the opposition party for the nomination, to get, a half an hour, 45 minutes of network, at least cable news network prime time at 8 p.m. to make his case. How much does he talk about this case? How much does he talk about the sort of the why it's unfair part of Hillary and Hunter Biden and Joe Biden and on and on? And then how much does he talk about the issues that voters say they care about, which, interestingly enough, the unfairness to Donald Trump is not on the top 10?
It depends on how close attention he's paying to his lawyers. I guess it depends a little bit on whether or not he has any lawyers by the time he speaks tonight. But what I'll be looking for tonight is the same thing I looked for when he was in Georgia and North Carolina over the weekend, which is he speaking extemporaneously or is he speaking off of the transcript? Keep in mind, this is a different situation than Manhattan. The Manhattan case was so weak against the president that even Democrats were scratching their head some Democrats were, as to why he was charged. This is very, very different. And anything that he says can and will be used against him in a court of law tonight. So you have to expect that if he's being smart, he will stick to the script, that the script will have been reviewed by the lawyers, and that he doesn't say anything that might get him in trouble. My experience is that he cannot help but to go off script a little bit, although he was very, very tight over the weekend to the extent where people were describing his speeches as low energy. I don't know how long he can keep that up. He hates that claim, by the way. He hates being described as low energy, but he only gets high energy when he goes off script. So be curious to see tonight how much of Donald Trump, the candidate, is there and how much Donald Trump, the now arraigned, accused criminal, is on display.
Yeah, and we have to remind everybody, this is 2 of 3, right? You've got the New York DA case, which, as you mentioned, there was an indictment, and reasonable people can agree it was pretty weak. Even, long-time Manhattan attorneys who were no fans of Donald Trump, criminal attorneys, said, hey, look, there's some serious questions in this case. This case, which I think reasonable people agree is a pretty strong one. You can argue the prosecutorial discretion side. You can argue whether there's similar cases being treated similarly, on and on and on. But the facts in the indictment, as we see it, are pretty strong. And then you've got the Georgia case, which is still the third wild card out there. In the sort of wildness of this as we watch a federal courthouse that a former president of the United States has been charged now with federal felonies, and if convicted, we have to say this, could face jail. Perhaps unlikely, depending on how you look at the sentencing guidelines, but it's still possible. Robert Sherman is outside the courthouse with a little bit more ahead of the president's departure. Hi, Robert.
Hey there, Leland. We think that we're going to get a lot more information in the next couple of minutes, but a couple of dribbles of info in order to give you here. We know that, of course, Eileen Cannon was the judge that was supposed to be presiding over this case. But here today, it was actually U.S. Magistrate Judge Jonathan Goodman who went out and said that he expected that he would just be overseeing what took place in court today and that it would likely go back to Eileen Cannon. So that was one change that I wanted to flag for you there. A couple other things to note as well is that the former president is allowed to leave court without conditions or any travel restrictions, which backs up what his legal counsel had to say earlier today. No cash bond is required. And Goodman also ruled that the former president not allowed to communicate with any potential witnesses involved in this case. It would have to go through legal counsel, but the former president not allowed to reach out to anybody. And when you look at that indictment, there were a couple of close associates in there that the former president had that are being used as key witnesses in this case. So those are a couple of things to note that we just got out of the courtroom, Leland.
Yeah, important tidbits, which tells us things have at least wrapped up in the courthouse. Robert Sherman standing by in Miami. Robert, I'm just thinking about this as I'm watching. This is the middle of June in Miami. I don't see a cloud in the sky there. It's got to be pretty hot, isn't it, outside?
Yeah, it's sweltering, Leland. It is about as hot as it can be here. And I can tell you that, a lot of people are still fighting through it here. You're seeing a lot of protest. You're seeing a few demonstrators here and there, as you've pointed out, Leland. I mean, the math, the quick math that you can do here clearly shows more law enforcement, more members of press than demonstrators here. But you do have a few people who are very motivated to be out here today. I can tell you wearing this suit and tie, definitely sweltering, to say the least.
We'll see if we can't send over some ice water once the president departs. You've earned it. Robert Sherman doing yeoman's work in front of the federal courthouse in Miami. Nick, talk to us just purely about the optics here of what President Trump and how he's going to try and produce this, because we know he sort of looks at things through the lens of a TV producer. And I get the idea that for some Republican voters, seeing the president be, quote unquote, persecuted motivates them. I wonder if there is a thought in Trump world that there's almost a fatigue factor that's going to set in. This is the second time we've done this of an indictment. And I think Niall brought up the point as well, that at some point, people just sort of say, I'm tired. I'm tired of the fight and of going through this on and on and on and on. How does President Trump fight back against that?
Leland, at the risk of not answering your question, I want to answer that question. It's a really good question. But Robert just said something that I think we need to talk to whoever the legal expert is in this conversation. Because what Robert just said was that the judge told Trump he can't talk to any witnesses. Okay, that makes sense to me. Walt Nauta is on the airplane with him this afternoon. At least Walt flew down with him on the way there. Walt has got to be a witness, and he's an indicted co-conspirator. How is it possible that Walt might be on the airplane flying back with Trump? Is Trump at risk now of committing another crime?
I'll bring the lawyers in, but my only thought would be is that you can't make Walt testify because he has a Fifth Amendment right not to.
I understand, but if Trump can't, but is he a witness? Did he see something, right? I mean, what if Walt ends up
Christy, you want to take this?
It's interesting because I was thinking the exact same thing. Was it clarified that by any witness who may have information about the conduct alleged in the indictment, was it clarified that the two co-defendants cannot speak to one another? That would be a very interesting thing to know in understanding the judge's order. Again, it sounds like the clarity in this would be, even if they cannot speak to one another, that they can communicate through their counsel, which is what you would expect to have occur. So it will be interesting if they are on the same plane back, if they're having communications. Again, they are both part of the same conduct. You would expect that no, they would not be able to speak to one another without counsel involved, given what it sounds like the judge's order was.
All right. Well, we'll see if Robert can't get a little bit more on that, and at least at some point, I think there's going to be a rush transcript coming out of the courthouse. So we will figure out what exactly the order was and was in the transcript. Mick, good flag on that. And you didn't answer my question, so now I'll give you that opportunity.
Trump absolutely sees this as a television show. There's no question about it. Keep in mind, there's a part of his personality that a lot of folks haven't picked up on, is that he doesn't hear the bad news. Okay, he doesn't. He blocks out the bad news. He's a strong believer of, in fact, the strongest I've ever met, of the power of positive thinking. So if his lawyers laid out, 99 things that could go wrong for him and one thing that could go right, you're going to expect him to talk about the one thing that could go right and to absolutely hammer on that. So I think that's what you hear him focusing on here, not only tonight, but as they go forward. I didn't talk to anybody. I didn't give this to anybody. The Chinese didn't get this, and he'll hammer on that again, again, and again. He'll try and figure out a way to turn that into the narrative. The man is excellent at controlling his own narrative. We saw here again with this indictment that he got ahead of the Department of Justice, just as he did in Manhattan when he got ahead of the DA. And he was the one who broke the announcement on his indictment. He did that on purpose. That was a made for television, made for social media type of event. So my guess is, and it's an educated guess, is what you'll see tonight and what you'll see going forward is turning this into reality TV. He grew up watching O.J. Simpson. He's going to want to figure out a way to make this the next big thing from a ratings perspective.
Yeah, look, we said it during the first indictment in New York, that when you were watching the Suburbans go to and from the courthouse, everyone thought of the white Ford Bronco.
He did the job I did in the White House. President Trump
I just want to
did.
stop you real quick. So this is the motorcade departing. These would be either deputies from Miami-Dade or Florida Highway Patrol that are closing off the highways for President Trump's departure. The pool that travels with the former president for big events. He doesn't have a formal press pool in the way the current president of the United States always does. They report that they are holding outside of the courthouse in the vans, although that was a couple of minutes ago. So now we're starting to see some movement. Joanna,
but
go ahead.
yeah, this was the job of orchestrating all of this coverage was always a staff job. And what I saw of President Trump is he knows how to control the cameras like no one else. Not only did he follow O.J. Simpson, he had his own reality TV show. And so he is getting things that we paid huge amounts of money for in the Obama campaign to try to get primetime coverage. And so he knows how to manipulate this. And if we're not careful, the media falls prey to him every single time.
But the media cannot not cover the arraignment of
they
a
have
former
to.
president.
Right.
of the
I
United
understand
States,
that.
Right? Yeah.
Yeah, no, look, you can't not cover it. I think the point's well made, though, that you have to cover it with the knowledge that an ordinary politician would want no coverage of bad things happening. Rule number one of politics, unless it's Donald Trump, who views basically if they spell my name right, or my face is on TV, or my name is in the chyron below, that it's good publicity. Which Mick, I think that was sort of the point that you were making.
We had a couple interactions.
I'm sorry, Leland, who was that for?
That was for you. That sort of the point being that President Trump believes if I'm on TV, it's good for me.
Look at it this way. We are not talking about Mike Pence's campaign today. We are not talking about Tim Scott's campaign. We're not talking about Ron DeSantis' campaign. He's going to figure out a way to simply suck all of the oxygen out of the room as he goes into the Republican primary. It's one of the reasons I think this bizarre sort of occurrence actually makes him more likely to be the Republican nominee for president, not less likely. It's going to be very difficult for anybody to break through.
Mick, I'm just going to interrupt you real quick. So we're seeing the first of the Secret Service SUVs head out of the courthouse. Then to the airport and off to Bedminster, New Jersey for a speech. You think about just the timing here. The speech is supposed to be at about 8:15 this evening. Even with the Secret Service driving, that's going to be a little bit of an ambitious time schedule. to be able to keep for speaking tonight. Go ahead, Mick.
Again, even when another candidate does break through, if they do, they're just going to break through in terms of what they have to say about Donald Trump. So it's really hard for them to get any differentiation. It's hard for them to get attention in their own right. Either they don't get any attention or they're only getting attention because people want to know what they think about Donald Trump. And that is a really, really hard way to win a primary election against somebody who's such a prohibitive favorite as Donald Trump.
I would say, though, Mick, if Iowa works right, that's like they're doing in-person events in people's living rooms. That's what right now, Nikki Haley and Mike Pence are doing, and that's not what Donald Trump is doing. So there is still a chance if they're telling it directly to the voters.
Robert Sherman is now with the producer who just got out of the courtroom. Go ahead, Robert.
Hey there, Leland. So we now have a lot more information on what went on in court here. First thing to talk about, one of the most significant developments, as we talked about earlier, Walt Nauta was in court today. He was actually not arraigned today, and he'll have to be back in court on the 27th. He does not have to appear in person, but that's because he does not have any local legal counsel here. So he's going to need somebody who is certified with the Florida bar in order to testify. So Walt Nauta is going to have to be back in court. We do not have any dates for what's going to happen next with the former president. There was a question that one of your guests asked Leland about Walt Nauta and the former president being able to talk with one another. So the prosecution has to provide a list of witnesses that the former president is not allowed to speak with. But the judge in this case did say that Nauta and the former president, they are allowed to talk to one another. They are not allowed to talk to one another about the parameters of this case as well. So that is a piece of logistical steps that have to be gotten through. That prosecution has to provide that list in order for this to proceed forward. As we mentioned before, no financial conditions. Nobody has to turn over passports. The former president did not say a single word in court today. Everything went through his attorney, Todd Blanche. Apparently, there was only one moment of emotion inside of that courtroom from the former president when Walt Nauta was speaking with the judge. I guess both Blanche and the former president had a couple of conversations. The former president smirked a couple of times, cracked a grin. That was it. That was the only emotion that apparently we got from Mr. Trump inside that courthouse today. So we still don't have a lot of information about where this is going to go next. There's still a few more logistical hurdles that need to be cleared here, Leland.
All right, and as we understand it, Robert Sherman, who's outside the courthouse, you can see the traffic stopped on the highways in Miami as the Secret Service motorcade heads out. Just real quick, Robert, give us the color now outside of the courthouse. What sort of is? We know the president's lawyers are going to talk at some point, right?
That's the understanding. Unless what they had to say they already said before they actually went into court today, because we're not expecting to get that from that one legal counsel member. So it is still quite possible. I would actually say that the energy here has simmered a little bit in the last hour. You don't have as many of the bullhorns and the whistles and things like that. It does feel as though that things are starting to trickle out here a little bit. Overall, the energy dropping bit by bit here. We will keep you closely posted if we get anything more from the former president's legal counsel outside the courthouse, Leland.
All right, we'll keep watching your camera, Robert. Flag us down when you get something. I would only add, perhaps, that people are hot and tired and interested in heading to get an ice cream cone or other beverage after many hours outside in the heat. We see the president's motorcade heading out on the helicopter shot right now. Mick Mulvaney here with us. Actually, Mick, stand by one second. I just want to bring in Will back based on what we heard sort of fully from what happened in court. An awful lot of time and energy is dedicated to what I think you predicted 2 hours ago would be a fairly mundane and routine hearing.
Yeah, it's always good to be right, Leland. I will say on the news we received about Walt Nauta, the only lawyer I've heard of currently representing him is Stanley Woodward, who made some pretty shocking allegations against Department of Justice lawyers involved in this investigation about a week ago. So it's unsurprising to me that he's scrambling to find local counsel and that his arraignment will be taken up on a later date. But All in all, it sounds like things went according to plan. And I expect we'll hear more from the president tonight, live from Bedminster.
Yeah, well, we'll certainly hear a lot from him tonight in that speech. I think this is fascinating, and I just want to bring this up, and I would toss it to Mick Mulvaney. Bill O'Reilly, who on Tuesday of last week sent out a very cryptic tweet in which he said the president is going to be indicted and you're going to hear about it on social media. That was 3 days ahead of the indictment. So think what you want of O'Reilly and think what you want of his sources, but he was dead on this issue. He just tweeted this. Donald Trump pleading not guilty in federal court, not a bulletin, because he believes he's not guilty. So here's a prediction. Most of the charges will eventually be thrown out because the prosecutors overreached in their quest for headlines. Okay, that's debatable, and there you go. This is the second part that I think is more interesting, Mick, on to you. However, the possession of classified material charge is valid, and that presents a problem for the former president, even if others did the same thing. I expect a plea bargain down the lane. Thoughts?
No chance. No chance, because plea bargain, I assume, I didn't practice criminal law, but from what I've seen on television, I'm pretty sure you have to plead guilty as part of a plea bargain. And I just can't see him doing that even to a misdemeanor. So I get it. I respect Bill. He's obviously got some good sources. I'd be curious to know which charges he thinks will be thrown out because the prosecutor overreached. Be interesting to know which specifically he's speaking about there. But I can't imagine. I've talked with folks who worked with me in the White House. None of us could envision Donald Trump pleading to anything in this, because that means he's pleading guilty to something, and he absolutely does not believe he's guilty.
No, just so we know what we're watching, it seems like the helicopter signal's broken up from overhead, from the pool that is traveling with President Trump as of 3:55, so 5 or 6 minutes ago we saw it live. We are rolling to a TBD location, which tells us that there may be a stop, but before President Trump heads to the airport. Where that would be, we don't know. We're still watching the motorcade. Say again, Johanna?
I said maybe to drop now to off.
Oh.
They're not allowed to.
Well, they're not allowed to talk about the case, is at least what we heard, rather than whether or not they're allowed to talk about. They're certainly allowed to interact. Mick, just looking forward through tonight, and I think you make a great point about politically, we're not talking about anything any of the other Republican candidates are saying. I guess the flip side of that, and this goes to what we've been talking about just from here in Washington, if you're Joe Biden, it's hard to have a better day either, because we're not talking about inflation right now. We're not talking about Chuck Grassley saying that there's a whistleblower who has a tape of Joe Biden and the CEO of Burisma. We're not talking about Hunter Biden. The coverage of this is pretty good politically for the White House as well.
Well, it does cut both ways. I think the inflation numbers are actually a little bit better. The inflation was down, I think, around to 4%, if I saw that correctly this afternoon. So to the extent that's good news, you can't get good news out either. The Ukrainian counteroffensive looks like it's doing okay. That's not getting out there. Look, Donald Trump is catnip to the media. There's no question. We've been sitting here. I don't know how long y'all have been here, but I've been here an hour and we haven't covered anything else. So we do it just like everybody else. The man is just catnip for the media, and he's going to continue to be. But yeah, your point is well taken, is that if the White House wanted to get a different message out today on any front, it would be very, very difficult for them to do so.
All right. Will Scharf, to you, when do we get the idea of what the president's defense looks like? When are we going to start seeing the first, and as much as I appreciate you and Christie's and Unkush's really learned and thoughtful analysis of this, you're not involved in the case. We have to say that. When is it that we get our first thought here on actually what the defense will look like?
So the way this case will proceed from here, the first step is for the defense to receive discovery. Based on the special counsel's statements about being ready to move to trial, I'm guessing that they are in a position to produce all or most of the relevant discovery on a pretty tight time frame. And then the question will be what sorts of pretrial motions President Trump's legal team want to file and how long it takes them to prepare those. But that's what I think we'll see in the coming weeks. First, a process that will be outside of kind of our eye line is that turning over of discovery materials. And then second, the strategic decisions that President Trump's legal team will make about how they want to start approaching this case and the sorts of motions that they'll want to file.
All right, Mick, just an update for color in terms of those of you who know Miami. This is not the route to the airport. It's the route to Little Havana. Mick, they're on their way to Versailles, the Cuban restaurant that's famous for Cuban sandwiches and the like. What do you make of that?
Actually, I was going to say something, but I didn't want to make light of a very serious situation. I was suggesting they probably go to McDonald's. The president is very famously addicted to burgers. We used to stop whenever we could with the motorcade to get McDonald's. So that was the first place my head went. Is they're probably going to get McDonald's, and I guess I wasn't wrong, not to offend the people at Versailles, the Cuban restaurant.
Yeah, no, what I think is kind of interesting, though, about it, I just think about it from a political standpoint, right? The Cuban vote in Miami is a powerful one in the Republican nomination fight. It's a very powerful one when it comes to the general election. It was Cuban immigrants and other immigrants that flipped Miami-Dade red for Ron DeSantis that we saw. We saw the former president at a Waffle House a couple of days ago when he was in I think it was in Georgia. But it feels like, Mick, that we're once again getting back into Donald Trump, the retail campaigner.
Yeah. He's great at it. I mean, think about the coverage he's going to get in the Cuban community in Florida, which is an early primary state, I think, again this year or next year. This is genius. It absolutely is. He's going to go to a friendly environment. He's going to go where he's very popular. Trump did extraordinarily well with the Cuban community, especially in South Florida. Doral is in sort of I think it's the Venezuelan area, so he's very familiar with that part of the city. Doral's also very close to the airport, so it's not home, it's not Bedminster, it's not Palm Beach, but it's close. So it's genius. My guess is he came up with that himself, and I'd be curious to know what Johanna thinks about it, but it sounds to me like it's a really, really smart move politically.
It is. No, and I was going to say, Mick, the OTR is the other option, and you could,
just
do both if you want to get now out of the car. You can.
OTR is an off-the-record stop, which is not publicized, but the press pool who's traveling knows that there's going to be a stop. And I think to be fair, we may be putting a little bit too much weight on whether Nowt is in the car or not. If they're allowed to talk and interact, then fine. Or we have no idea whether he was in the motorcade or not.
We have no idea.
We have no idea.
But this is smart politics to Mick's point.
This is really, and we're going to get the aerial shot back of the motorcade headed to the Cuban restaurant. And I think, Niall, to your point, this cuts both ways also into what Mick was saying, that this kind of coverage for Donald Trump is as good as it gets, of him heading to a friendly crowd to work the Cuban restaurant and buy everybody Cuban sandwiches. I think the motorcades, they've got a camera there waiting for him at Versailles.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think I want to link this back to a point both you and Mick made earlier on. What we're watching here right now is a former president and the leading candidate for the Republican nomination being arraigned on criminal charges. And the question is what difficulty this poses to his rival Republican candidates, right? That is a real question for those rivals. How do they get publicity? How do they get into this situation? How do they react to this situation? It does just underline that point about the uniqueness of Donald Trump as a political figure, that we're having him here on criminal charges. And the challenge is one that has been posed to his rivals. How did they get into this picture? When in fact we have now footage of him at Versailles, which has delicious food. I can certainly personally testify to that. And politics and pastries for Mr. Trump in the wake of a criminal arraignment.
Look, and he's owning the news cycle in every way, shape, and form. He's going to walk in and he's going to buy, we know this because we've been on these trips, he's going to buy Cuban sandwiches for him and for the Secret Service and for everybody inside, and then they're all going to go to the plane and they're going to eat on the plane. We're going to thank Christy, former federal prosecutor who's been with us, Will Scharf as well for excellent legal analysis, Mick Mulvaney, who's here as well, and then obviously in the studio, Johanna and Niall, good to see both of you. We're going to keep up the pictures of President Trump as he heads inside. We believe there may be a camera inside. We'll try to turn up what we call the natural sound, if you will, to hear the president, former president, as he goes and greets folks and talks about whatever happened, which will be the very first comments he makes in terms of what happened in court will probably be just in a couple of minutes in a Cuban restaurant, no less. So with that, a little bit of business we've got to get to. We're going to turn it over to Nicole, who is back in Chicago. The Hill is on at 5 p.m. Blake Berman's going to be here. That'll be as the former president is heading to the airport. And I'll see you back here at 7 o'clock Eastern to begin our special coverage of, there we go. Let's turn up the sound and see what we can listen into, guys.
I'm never gonna fight this guy out there. Jorge, how you doing? Very good, sir. He's a great guy. He's a champion. He likes to fight. You're the champion. You're the champion. For you. Yes, please. Let's gather around. Come on.
Father, we thank you that you've given us President Trump to stand against the wave that's coming against our nation. Father, as Cuban Americans, we declare communism will not come to our shores. Father, we thank you that you've anointed him and called him for this time. In Jesus' name, amen. Amen.
Padre, vengo ante ti a pedirte por este varón, Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, bendito tú eres, Padre, creador del universo. Te pido que unjas a este hombre con toda fortaleza, disipando toda tiniebla, todo principado que se haya levantado en contra de él. Dale fortaleza en sus manos, dale firmeza en su cuerpo, dale ese espíritu de poder y dominio propio. En el nombre de Jesús lo declaramos libre de toda maldición y toda maldición. Decimos amén, amén. God bless you.
All right, we see former President Trump there at Cafe Versailles. It's a common political meeting place there in Miami. The former president making an unexpected stop after leaving a Miami federal courthouse today. A quick reset for you. Good afternoon to you. I am Nicole Burley. We want to get you up to speed on everything that has happened so far on this very busy news day. Just about an hour ago in that Miami courtroom, former President Donald Trump arraigned on 37 federal charges stemming from alleged mishandling of classified documents. Mr. Trump faces 7 different felony charges ranging from obstructing justice to willful detention of national defense information. He did plead not guilty